Now, G7 leaders vowed solidarity with Ukraine for as long as it takes. The joint show of support for Kyiv came after Ukraine's president addressed leaders this morning. Volodymyr Zelensky called for sanctions on Russia to be ramped up in order to end the war by the end of this year. Now, the focus of the G7 summit is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conflict's knock-on effects. We can now bring in Tristen Naylor, lecturer in international politics and history at the University of Cambridge. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 today. Now, President Zelensky is calling for sanctions on Russia to be ramped up. The sanctions so far have failed to influence Vladimir Putin's thinking nor change the course of the war. What will sanctions do now if they're ramped up?
Well, so far the sanctions have not definitively changed the course of the war, but they're unquestionably having an effect on the war. I mean, without question, the strategic aims that Vladimir Putin has been reduced somewhat. Any fresh sanctions is going to feed into further decision-making and whether or not to keep going, to stop, or even retreat. And really it comes down to the size, the intensity, and the severity of those sanctions as to what will happen next. And that is unquestionably what is on the forefront of all the leaders' minds as they meet here over today and tomorrow.
One of the proposals from the G7 is potentially capping the price of Russian oil. Firstly, is that feasible, and how would it work?
Well, it's something that's difficult to do, and certainly imposing caps on any sort of market, let alone the oil market, is something that's incredibly difficult to do, not least of all when there are still plenty of markets for Russian oil. You know, one of the key meetings that I'm looking at on the sidelines of the summit this weekend are the interactions between the G7 leaders and the Indian Prime Minister. I think one of the key strategic objectives of the G7 leaders over the next day and a half is to try to drive a wedge between India and Russia, between the Indian Prime Minister and the Russian President, and try to bring him firmly into the Western camp.
But that is unlikely to happen. Sorry to interrupt you there, but that's unlikely to happen because of how India and Russia's relations have been for decades now. And India, on the world stage at the United Nations, did not condemn Russia's invasion. Instead, they abstained.
Absolutely. You know, abstention, though, is an ambiguous position, and that's why I think that the G7 do believe that they have a chance. They have an opportunity to try to twist Prime Minister Modi's arm. Whether or not they can do it remains to be seen. It certainly is not going to be an easy task, but they are without question devoting their energies to it on the sidelines of the meetings, certainly this afternoon.
Because often we hear from G7 leaders, Western leaders from the United States, here in Europe as well, who sort of say Vladimir Putin is alienated on the world stage, when in fact the large part of the world, when we're thinking of the African continent, Latin America, India, China, etc., they still have relations with Russia, and which is why we're seeing people buy Russian oil at a discount, including countries like China and India.
Absolutely, and I think it is easy to forget that actually the Russian president is not completely alienated from certainly all of the potential international partners that he has in the world. Certainly alienated from the West, but the West actually is a relatively sort of small proportion of the world. But what I think is really interesting is the major infrastructure package that was announced yesterday by the leaders of the G7. One of the audiences for that is certainly Beijing, but it's also the Kremlin. It is sending a message to potential allies of Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin that the G7 offers an alternative, and partnering with the G7 is a far more advantageous thing to do than to be partnering with Vladimir Putin and the Russian state as it presently is.
Well, we'll see if the leaders of those emerging markets who have gathered there where you are can be arm-twisted. We'll see how things pan out. Tristen Naylor, thank you very much for joining us on the program today.